WatchGuard Capital. Invest your time wisely. This is part 2 of why we need a flat federal tax system and why you don't matter in DC. In part 1, we reviewed why our current system is broke using the 2019 complete report for individual income tax returns. And a quick review, 11% of Americans, or 17 million out of 157 million, itemized deductions in 2019, and the other 89%, or 138 million, took the standard deduction, which was $12,200 for a single person and $24,400 for a married couple. And those were the amounts that could be earned before an American started paying federal income tax, which ranged from 10% to 37% and increased as income increased. The second federal tax was the flat 12.4% Social Security tax levied on the first $132,900 of income and nothing above that. And the third federal tax was the quasi-flat Medicare tax of 2.9% for a single filer up to $200,000 and $250,000 for a married couple and 3.8% above that with no cap. And now that we have a basic understanding of our current tax rates, it's time to see why you don't matter in DC. Now you won't be able to read this chart because the relative difference between your influence in DC compared to our wealthiest Americans and their ability to make political contributions is so large it can't be shown in a graphic that would fit on one screen. So I'll have to explain it as we go along. Each one of these black dots is actually a stick figure representing tax filings per 10,000 returns, and each of these yellowish dots is actually a pile of cash representing $5,000 in disposable income to help you visualize how our current federal tax system is working. The first group we will review is the poor. These stick figures represent the 1,250 tax filers per 10,000 that make up the poor, or 12.5% of all American tax filers in 2019. They claimed $1,000 to $10,000 of income, or $5,000 on average. They are so poor that they do not pay federal income tax and actually receive tax credit refunds. We do extract Social Security and Medicare taxes from their potential wages, resulting in an effective tax rate of 6.9%, which honestly doesn't make any sense. These 19.7 million American tax filers and their employers shouldn't be paying taxes at all on this amount of income. Their effective tax rate should be zero, and the fact that it's not zero implies that they have one vote and no influence, and the poor don't matter in DC. The next group is the near poor. These stick figures represent the 1,340 tax filers per 10,000 that make up the near poor, or 13.4% of all American tax filers in 2019. They claimed incomes of $10,000 to $20,000, or $14,800 on average. There were 21.1 million tax filers in this group, and they didn't pay federal income taxes either, and also received tax credit refunds, but paid federal Social Security and Medicare taxes, resulting in an effective tax rate of 3.3%, which should also be 0% because it's hard to survive on $1,200 a month in this country, and also means they probably don't have discretionary funds to make political contributions. So they have one vote, no influence, and the near poor don't matter in DC either. 27.3% of all American tax filers claimed less than $20,000 of income in 2019, so they don't quite have the numbers to demand change by themselves. The next group is the lower working class. These stick figures represent the 1,190 tax filers per 10,000 that made up the 18.7 million American tax filers in the lower working class, or 11.9% that claimed incomes of $20,000 to $30,000. They too don't pay federal income tax, they too receive tax credit refunds, and they too paid federal Social Security and Medicare tax, resulting in an effective tax rate of 10.7%. They have one vote, no influence, and they don't matter in DC. And on that note, you may have heard that these bottom three classes of Americans do not pay federal income taxes, which is absolutely true because they don't make enough for us to justify taking it from them. But they do pay federal Social Security and Medicare taxes. And in this video titled Myself IOUs, I explained how the federal government used those taxes that weren't necessary to pay immediate benefits to cover hundreds of billions of dollars of general expenses for decades because not enough federal income tax was collected. So their contributions absolutely mattered, they just don't get credit for them. And anyone that says these Americans don't pay federal taxes actually means federal income taxes and usually doesn't understand how intergovernmental transfers work. Moving on. The next group is the upper working class, or the 1,810 tax filers per 10,000, or 18.1% that claimed incomes of $30,000 to $50,000, or $39,000 on average. There were 28.6 million American tax returns filed by the upper working class. They paid positive federal income, Social Security, and Medicare taxes for an effective federal tax rate of 16.5% on average. It's the largest group of individuals reviewed so far, and combined with the poor, near poor, and lower working class, made up 57.3% of all tax filers in 2019. So if these four groups coordinated, they could absolutely have a voice, but they don't, so their representatives don't even take their calls, because the upper working class don't matter in DC. The next group we'll review is the lower middle class. These stick figures represent the 2,300 tax filers per 10,000, or 23% that claimed incomes of $50,000 to $100,000, or $71,000 on average. There were 36.4 million American tax filers in the lower middle class that paid an effective federal tax rate of 20.7%. This group had disposable income of $60,000, but given the amount of money it takes to buy a politician these days, they have one vote and no influence, and the lower middle class don't matter in DC. Which is unfortunate because 80% of all tax filers claim less than $100,000 in 2019, which means we have the votes to demand a better tax code than the atrocity that we're currently saddled with, constantly fighting over and don't understand, we just haven't demanded it yet. If the lower middle class didn't tip the collective political scale in our favor to demand change, the next group absolutely would. The upper middle class are the 1,390 per 10,000, or 13.9% of tax filers, that claimed incomes of $100,000 to $200,000 of income, or $136,000 on average. There were 22 million American filers in the upper middle class that paid average federal income taxes of $14,500, average federal Social Security taxes of $16,480, and remember that number, and average federal Medicare taxes of $3,960, for an effective federal tax rate of 23.8%. They have enough to live comfortably, but not enough to buy an election, so they have one vote, no influence, and the upper middle class don't matter in DC. Which is sad because 94.3% of Americans made less than $200,000 in 2019. The next group is the 460 American filers per 10,000, or 4.6%, that claimed incomes of $200,000 to $500,000 of income, or $286,000 on average. There were 7.3 million American filers in this class, sometimes referred to as members of the top 5% because they were doing much better economically than the bottom 95% of Americans in the poor, working, and middle classes. They have one vote and possibly some influence in DC, but relative to the resources available to the higher earners above them, they'd be lucky to get a handshake from a politician, which means that 98.9% of Americans made less than $500,000 in 2019, and they don't matter in DC. Including the 5%ers who paid an average of $47,000 in federal income tax, $16,480 in federal Social Security tax, and $10,800 in federal Medicare taxes for an effective federal tax rate of 25.1%. But notice the amount of Social Security tax being paid by the last two groups didn't increase and is the same. That is because there is a maximum amount of earnings on which Social Security taxes are collected, which is set annually. That cap was $3,000 in 1937 when the government started collecting Social Security taxes and stayed that amount until 1950. It was $132,900 in 2019 and $160,200 in 2023. And if you support eliminating or massively increasing this cap to not cut Social Security benefits, which will be required by current law if nothing is changed, that's another reason to support consolidating these taxes into a single unified federal flat tax rate, because there'd be no reason to have separate ones going forward, just base benefits on the total amount of federal taxes paid over time. The next groups are the top 1% of American tax filers. The first group of the top 1% are the 74 per 10,000 tax filers, or 0.74%, that claimed incomes between $500,000 and $1 million. There were 1.1 million of them, and they paid an effective federal tax rate of 28.7%, and their influence in DC is minor at best. The next group of the top 1% is the 16 per 10,000 American tax filers, or 0.16%, that claimed incomes between $1 million and $1.5 million. There were 254,000 of them that paid an effective federal tax rate of 30.7%. They have some political influence. The next group of the top 1% is the 7 per 10,000 American tax filers, or 0.7%, that claimed incomes between $1.5 and $2 million. There were 103,000 of them that paid an effective federal tax rate of 31.3%. They have some political influence as well. The next group of the top 1% are the 9 per 10,000 American tax filers, or 0.9%, that claimed incomes between $2 and $5 million. There were 144,000 of them that also paid an effective federal tax rate of 31.3%. They have great political influence and probably do matter in DC, but you're probably not one of them, so you still don't. The next group of the top 1% are the 2 per 10,000 American tax filers, or 0.2%, that claimed incomes between 5 and 10 million and paid effective tax rates of 30.8%. Their incomes are massive compared to all the other individuals, so they have massive influence in our political system, and they matter. But on a relative basis, even they don't matter compared to the last group of the top 1%, or the coveted top 0.01%. There's only one of these tax filing unicorns per 10,000 that claimed income over $10 million in 2019. These 21,000 American tax filers claimed $28 million of income, paid an effective federal tax of 28.3%, or $8 million in federal taxes, resulting in disposable incomes of $20 million on average. Their pockets are so deep that their extreme political influence rivals that of the other 9,999 tax filers combined. And remember, if this represents $5,000 in disposable income, then this is the $5,000 to $15,000 available to the poor, this is the $25,000 to $35,000 available to the working class, this is the $50,000 to $110,000 available to the middle class, and this is the $225,000 available to the 5%ers to buy a voice in DC. Then they all brought a knife to a gunfight, because this is the $20 million available to the top 0.01% of American tax filers. And if these red boxes indicate each individual's relative influence in DC based on their disposable income, and everyone in this box represents 98.9% of Americans that claimed incomes below $500,000 in 2019, or $9,890 per 10,000, they don't matter in DC. And that's why the American tax code was not written for them, and why we need a unified flat federal tax system now more than ever. Because in part 3 of this series, I'll combine the federal income, Social Security, and Medicare tax rates into a single unified flat federal tax rate of 30%, which is basically what these groups were paying anyways. Increase the standard deduction to achieve a 0% effective rate for the poor, which is what it should have been to make American labor more competitive. Decrease taxes owed by the working and middle classes, but not collected by the government under our current system, while restoring democracy and balancing their voting power against their political contributions. And if you're thinking, why didn't my politician come up with this plan? It's because you don't matter in DC.